Okay, this is going to be a final review of my upstairs hall hardwood floor project. I did a video previous showing a lot of the techniques, so this is going to be just a short video showing the final product and just the techniques that I've used since the last video. Now, one thing that I've done here is I have filled the finished nail holes with the wood putty. And then I went a little bit further and I took the wood putty and I filled any gaps. So at the miter, that's not a tongue and groove, and I just worked in that putty there because I know over time dirt is just going to fill that in anyway. So I'm hoping that the putty will just fill it better than the dirt, and that the putty won't just get discolored over time and help to maintain the natural color. Eventually these lines tend to turn more blackish as dirt fills in the little micro bevels. So whenever there was a crack that wasn't just the micro bevel, but was due to the fact that the wood is not always exactly the same width, so that if this one was a little bit narrow than this one, and I put this board next to it, you would actually get what I call a day zero gap, where it's not just the micro bevel of the wood against the wood, there's actually a physical space. Now, in this case, whenever I saw a physical space, and here's an example of that here. This is actually a tongue and groove, but as I was constructing the order of assembly in the miter, I didn't get this as tight as I could. So I filled that day zero crack with just the wood putty again, so it wouldn't fill in with dirt so quickly. The putty might not last forever. It could dry out, crack, and eventually come out. But I don't think there's any harm done in putting it in on the first day. It just takes a little extra time. So here's a few other things. Just to mention a few other things. I nailed the transition pieces in place. And another thing that I've done here is I used the silicone caulk to caulk under the baseboards. That's you can see other people doing that. Under the baseboard there is that gap. It's just an empty space, so water, if it spilled on the floor, could run right into that gap, and sealing the gap is probably an okay thing to do. I just used the urethane caulk around the entire floor. Baseboard, trim piece. You'll see, for example, right in under the undercut, there would be a little gap there that would actually go in underneath the door jamb. I filled that. I actually filled the gap here where the transition piece, because this is not a tight seal, that's just nailed down. And the same thing, there's a gap underneath this board. So I just put the caulk along that line, just to help seal that gap. The idea is to try to seal the space as good as I can. And I don't think there's any harm done in doing that. Now I will show some of the defects in the floor. You wouldn't notice them really, but since I'm the installer, I kind of know where they are, and I could improve next time, hopefully by taking careful attention to those types of issues. So one issue was, I noticed I did have a space where I had what I would call a significant bump. Now, probably what happened there was right under this, as this was sealing up, there was probably a defect in the subfloor that's pushing this up. It might have been a nail head that I didn't pound down hard enough, although I really go over very carefully every single nail head. So I can't say exactly what caused this, and as I was putting it in, I didn't really notice it. Not until afterwards, after everything had been nailed in place. Now, I could obviously sand that down, but I'm not going to do that. You never really notice that, actually, until you know that it's there, okay? So that's not going to be a big deal, but it is an imperfection. The subfloor, getting the subfloor flat is critical. Another thing you'll notice here that strictly violates the rule is the so-called H pattern. Notice, just by the randomness, those lines, they just happen to kind of line up. They even line up with the one that's here. But honestly, regular people don't notice that. But you should avoid the H pattern. On adjacent boards, you'd like to stagger them. by a certain number of inches. It's not nice when they come up really close to each other. It's a disaster if they're on adjacent boards, if they're right across from each other. That's a major no-no. But even if they're really close, that looks bad. And then even on the one that's next adjacent, when they're exactly across from each other, this one is actually a space of 2, so it's not as bad. But when there's only one board between them and you have one that's exactly that's like, they call that an H. And that's to be avoided. So overall, I was happy with it. So anyway, this is just a final review, just so you can see how it came out. So I did have a closet in here. I had a slight little problem in the closet, but it's not a big deal. It's a closet. So like for example here, I cut the longer boards down. At this point I hit only longer boards, and then rather than staggering them, you can see these 3 are actually from the same long board, and then these 3 are from the same long board, and then this 2 are from the same long board, and then finally I intermingled another board in there to try to mix it up a little bit. So when you look at that and you say, well, that's not really as mixed as it should be, and it isn't, because I wasn't thinking. I was just using up my last couple of boards. I should have cut them and then mixed them up. So that's another little mistake. But it's the floor of a closet. Nobody will ever see it. Okay? So anyway, that's all. Thanks. Bye.